In the blink of an eye, Night Terrors was over. In DC Comics' next event, Batman, Catwoman, the Gotham War had begun, and there almost wasn't enough time to think about what Night Terrors was, what it all meant, and whether or not it was good or not. And I believe basically after what I've read about it, what I consumed of it myself, and some of the numbers that we're seeing coming out of the sales of Night Terrors, especially in the second month, this is nothing but an unmitigated disaster. People should be very worried at DC Comics when it comes to their job security at this point. They've delivered dud after dud after dud. And in the case of Night Terrors, he actually interrupted a couple of series that were really building up momentum, getting people excited about DC Comics again. And then he come out with an event that ended up meaning almost nothing, really just was kicking off another event and was a placeholder for 2 months to interrupt stuff that people were enjoying reading. Thankfully, we still got a couple of issues of Batman, Superman, World's Finest, and a couple other series. Thankfully, we actually got a couple of issues of Batman, Superman, World's Finest, and a couple of other titles. So you at least had something to read if you were a DC fan and you didn't want to read Night Terrors. And it appears a lot of people didn't want to read Night Terrors, and the ones that started it and made it to the end absolutely regretted it. I'm going to talk about this article from superherohype.com, which is an interesting site. They're not overly critical, but they're pretty damn honest. And if you like superhero related toys and stuff like that, I think it's actually kind of a cool site because it incorporates all of that. You get your comic book news, you get your movie news, you get your TV news, but you also get your toy news kind of all in one site. But I thought they had some very interesting things to say about Night Terrors. And then we're going to talk about the actual sales data that we do have, which is limited, but certainly shows that Night Terrors was absolutely an enormous folly on the part of DC Comics. The chief problem with Night Terrors was that Insomnia and the Sleepless Nights are redundant to the DC universe. In terms of powers, there's little effective difference between Insomnia and Dr. Destiny, who also menace the Justice League through their dreams. The Sleepless Nights, while horrific, seem like a less developed take on the Dark Knights of Dark Knight's Metal. It should be noted that Insomnia was given a unique origin near the end of Night Terrors to explain his hatred of superheroes. He was revealed as a loving family man who lost his wife and children during an unspecified disaster. Insomnia came to blame the Justice League and superheroes in general for his family's death. And I happen to agree with superherohype.com right here. While I don't believe that the original sin of Night Terrors itself was that the villain himself wasn't really compelling, I think the idea in general and just going ahead with it without actually having a really strong story and a reason to actually do it was the original sin. But certainly compounding upon that was not delivering a really fully fleshed out cool villain that felt like they could be this enormous threat to the DC Comics universe that had something unique about them. A lot of people did bring up Dr. Destiny. They're like, well, where is this guy? It's basically the same villain at this point. And then when the author talks about like there's a unique origin story to the character, that's not really unique. Like the guy got mad at superheroes because his family died while they were defending something and there was an accident. And then he became like a ruthless killer and decided he was going to take him down. That's kind of played out. That's actually been done quite a few times. So there really wasn't anything unique about the character of Insomnia himself, other than kind of the look. And the look, because there were so many different artists that were illustrating the character of Insomnia, depending on where you started, sometimes he did kind of look menacing. Sometimes he did look kind of nightmarish, but most of the time he kind of just looked like a joke. If you read that Punchline series, Night Terrors Punchline, like he was a girl and he dressed up like Punchline and you're like, okay, I guess he's going full Freddy Krueger and he's going for the jokes and laughs. And there was no like real consistency to the character himself to where he could be a breakout star or a breakout villain that you could do some things with, or that could really mean something to the long-term DC universe and maybe you could use him again in the future because he was so successful. He was just so generic. And when he was used, he was so inconsistent from title to title. You're like, I don't even understand what the character is. And then the origin itself was stupid. He blamed the Justice League because a building fell down on his family and killed him. Okay, well, that's fine. Not exactly unique, but that origin we can work with. So he decided to become a serial killer that refused to sleep, but he never actually tells the Justice League he's killing people because of what the Justice League did, or he never tries to like get him in a trap or anything. He just keeps killing people until he gets caught, gets put into a coma by the state, and then still gets hit by Chubby Rain, even though he was inside of a building. And then the Lazarus Rain gave him powers of nightmare powers, which, you know, worked out really well because his name was Insomnia as a serial killer. Like it didn't make a whole lot of sense and ended up being really stupid. So the payoff itself wasn't worth it. The juice wasn't worth the squeeze. And I think Insomnia was a big part of that. Absolutely terrible creative on the part of Josh Williamson and his editorial staff coming up with this character. And then also not really working with the other writers to get down why this character is dangerous. What makes him unique? What can we do with him that is going to give the readers nightmares? It never really happened. He became more of a joke. And that's another issue that I think really needs to be solved by DC Comics. Sorry to segue there. But DC Comics, apparently, their new model for events is like you get a showrunner. Like on Lazarus Planet, the showrunner would have been Mark Waid. On Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths, the showrunner would have been Josh Williamson. In Night Terrors, the showrunner would have been Josh Williamson. And like, I guess he picks out the team and he does the creative direction, and then he's entitled to, like, I guess, a portion of the page rates that the writers are getting. At least that's the rumor that was out there that no one ever said wasn't true. And this should probably all but kill that as well, because it's clear as day that Josh Williamson is going out of his way to write events that they don't need to make just so he can get other people's page rates, or at least half of it. I think that's really what's going on here. So we're getting events that have no stakes, that have no meaning to them, just for the sake of having events themselves, which serves DC's purpose, because I guess they want to be an event-driven comic publisher and have a lot of number one issues, but also apparently the showrunners themselves, you get a little extra payola for being the guy on top. I think this should probably kill that idea as well, because none of these things have worked out very well. Another problem with Night Terrors was that the quality of the tie-ins varied wildly. The best tie-ins were those written by the monthly series regular creative teams. Most of those books tied into current storylines and analyzed the characters through their nightmares. The Poison Ivy crossover was a good example of this. Pamela Isley found herself living with Harley Quinn in a twisted suburb, a la the Stepford Wives, an idyllic life surrounded by former enemies trying to befriend her, while ideal for Harley was a nightmare for the introverted and paranoid Ivy. This put a new spin on the Harley Ivy romance, which the current Poison Ivy series examined in earlier issues. Sadly, most of the tie-ins lack such insightful analysis. That's because there was like no through line, so most of the tie-ins just existed so that they could be tied into Night Terrors. It doesn't matter what you do, you just got to make a nightmare version. Whatever the biggest fear is, that's what you need to do with the character. And, all gloves are off. I'm going to get half of your page rate, for writing it because I'm the overseer. But I don't really care what you do. And none of this is actually going to matter to the mainline story. And it makes for a really terrible reading experience, especially if you were one of the morons that actually bought into this premise and was like, you know what? I'm going to buy all 48 issues of Night Terrors related material released in 2 months only. And we're basically just going to stop all the momentum and enthusiasm that had been generated by a couple of key titles like Green Lantern from Jeremy Adams, like Green Arrow from Josh Williamson. Superman was going very well. Action Comics was going very well. And DC Comics, while not doing great, at least had a little bit of buzz, a little bit of hype that was really elevating some of these titles. And maybe with the right tweak here and there, maybe another title or two coming out, along with Batman, Superman, World's Finest, maybe we've got some winners here and a real foundation to build off of. But they basically just destroyed all of it and made all these good writers that had insightful things to do, that were really going with these characters and doing cool things. We need you to take a time out and do this other thing that's going to kill all the momentum of the series, and basically ends up being the biggest jumping off point that you could ever imagine. And you're going to see that in the numbers themselves. I personally only read 2 tie-ins to this. I read the Batman tie-in and I read the Punchline tie-in. The Batman tie-in was certainly much better, but it wasn't great. And the Punchline tie-in was an absolute joke. And it sounds like, for the most part, a lot of these B, C level actors that were in their own starring roles in these Night Terror series, that's basically what happened in those series as well. There is a standout here and there, but for the most part, it was very blasé. And it didn't feel very cohesive. It didn't feel like a real event. It felt like a placeholder, and it felt very not important by the end. And of course, you get the conclusion, and all of your fears are concerned. You're like, oh my goodness, I just wasted 2 months of my life and $180 on nothing. And that's not a good feeling to give your customers when they're done with your big event. And now you want them to jump into the next Batman-led event, and it doesn't look very good for that either. I'll talk about that also when we get to the sales numbers. But to conclude this article and what the author was saying, Night Terrors offers little sense of resolution to its own story. Indeed, it makes it seem like the only reason this story was told in the first place was to set up the next big crossover event. The final issue ends with Insomnia vanquished, but ultimately successful in his larger goal of giving humanity a fear of their heroes. This is quickly exploited by Amanda Waller, who steals the Nightmare Stone for her own ends. The comic concludes with Waller declaring it's time to move against the Titans. And that's the last page of the comic book. Is the big conclusion to Night Terrors is Beast World is kicking off, and we're going to have Dr. Hate because we don't have enough puns about the characters that already exist. Josh Williamson didn't just create Shush for Batman, instead of Hush, it's going to be the female version. Like, why do they keep just doing puns on names that already exist? No, well, now he's the evil Dr. Fate, so he's Dr. Hate. It's not the worst name in the world, but after a while, it just kind of becomes a joke. And then the ending itself, the whole world were having nightmares, I guess, about superheroes or whatever, and they woke up and believed them. It's like, whatever, man. Grow up. Sometimes you have nightmares, but you know that it didn't actually happen. It was such a stupid premise, and the payoff was just awful. And then once you get the confirmation that this really wasn't an event that was supposed to lead to anything, any type of meaningful change that was going to have real repercussions that were really going to play out over the next year in DC Comics, not only do you kick off right into this Batman event, which mentions it a couple of times, but has nothing to do with anything really that happened in this event other than he's got a metal hand now. And then also, oh, don't forget about Beast World. That is absolutely not the reason that the few people that really bought into Night Terrors bought into it. So like, oh, wow, we're going to get Dr. Hate and Beast World. A Tom Taylor-led event, like, sign me up. And at the end, DC Comics just kind of makes people feel stupid for even buying into the hype and everything. Now, you would hope there'd be enormous sales with this, and there are a couple of sales successes, but remember, they were releasing over 22 titles associated with Night Terrors a month for the 2 months they were doing this. And the numbers are in, and it does not look good whatsoever. In fact, it looks downright terrible. This is an absolute catastrophe for DC Comics. In the top 20, DC Comics only got 2 titles into the top 20 for the month of September. This is an absolute nightmare of biblical scale for DC Comics. They expect an event to actually increase sales. That didn't really happen. Sure, Night Terrors Batman did come in at number 2 because it said Batman. Then we have to go all the way down to number 15, Night Terrors number 3, and then you get Night Terrors number 4 and at number 21, although that was at the end of the month, so you'll have less sales. Maybe that would have been a top 20 seller if it hadn't been released in the last week, but those are really bad numbers. The next book is Batman Superman World's Finest, and then that's basically it for the top 25. You actually have to go all the way down to number 32, Batman Catwoman The Gotham War Battle Line number 1. Absolute disaster for DC Comics on their part. Batman is their marquee character, and I thought Chip Zdarsky Batman event, probably not the worst thing in the world, especially if you got Jorge Jimenez coming back. But then you hear about this whole Tinny Howard part of it. Oh, she's going to tie in Catwoman to this. And it doesn't sound like, initially at least, from the sales data that we do have, which is very limited and very faulty, that a lot of people were very interested in jumping into the Gotham War right after Night Terrors was over. You can't just keep hopping and hopping and hopping and hopping from event to event and really build enthusiasm or excitement for the titles at that point. The event itself needs to be the culmination of the excitement. That needs to be the crescendo, the really big moment at the end that really gets you excited and you're like, oh, I'm so glad I bought into Batman and Flash and Green Lantern and Green Arrow. I knew they were doing great stuff. And look at the way they concluded it. They decided to bring all the stories together for this really big moment. And oh, I've never been so excited about comic books in my life. But they don't treat events like that. They're just little mile markers as you move your way through the year. They don't really mean anything. They're very insignificant at this point. And you wonder why there's no enthusiasm. And they keep doing event after event after event after event. Guess what happens to Batman? You can't have a DC event without including Batman. So Batman has to get interrupted 3 or 4 times a year. Of course, Superman's got to be in there. So Superman or Action Comics, or perhaps both, have to be interrupted 3 or 4 times a year. And all these marquee titles never have a chance to fully recover from all the damage that was done the last 3 years. It's absolute insanity on the part of DC Comics Place that they haven't learned any lessons, that they're following this Marvel method that has not brought anyone any type of prosperity, has certainly not elevated the comic book industry. And in most ways, when you look at it, it appears that it drove more people away than it brought in the end. Absolute unmitigated disaster on the part of DC Comics. Night Terrors should be called Night Errors. Huge miscalculation on the part of Jim Lee and the brain trust at DC Comics. Earlier in the video, I did mention there was a rumor out there how DC Comics were managing their events where they're basically getting like a showrunner, and then that showrunner is entitled to a piece of the page rates of the other people working on the event underneath them. No one ever said this wasn't true. No one ever said that is an absolute lie. My assumption is this is all truth, and it's one of the weirdest things I've ever heard in my life. And if I was a big time creator at DC Comics, you couldn't get me to come back to this place. What a stupid idea this was. I break it all down right here, and I was not very happy. There's also a link in the video description.